Welcome to the Voodoo Power Podcast.
Welcome to Plates and Pancakes. We're sitting down today with Pete Bommarito. Coach Bommarito is the owner and president of Bommarito Performance Systems. He's regarded as one of the top coaches in the industry, thanks to his innovative, scientifically based approach to sport-specific training. Bommarito completed an internship with the Indianapolis Colts in 1999. The next year, he became the director of the country's most successful NFL Combine preparation program at the world-renowned International Performance Institute in Bradenton, Florida. In 4 years, the program produced 15 first-round draft picks, including Eli Manning, the number 1 overall pick in the 2004 NFL Draft. Bommarito also directed the performance program for the Florida Collegiate International League, a highly successful wood bat league that produced over 75 MLB draft picks during his tenure. Coach Bommarito is one of the nation's most sought-after speakers and for his expertise in all aspects of performance enhancement. So welcome to the show, Coach.
How's it going?
Good. I spent the week, kind of digging into your stuff, and I found two things that were some of the best things I found in a long time, and that was your Sore Neck Summer Strong presentation on back dorsiflexion and an NSCA presentation you did that you dug deep in your dynamic method. Both of those were just incredible presentations.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
So one of the things you touched on both of those is force on a tissue that is not able to absorb it and redirect it is where your injuries will occur. So getting the tissue where it accepts more force, how are you able to prepare some of these high-level athletes to receive that force and redirect it?
Yeah, I think that we have to look at, if you look at the support system prep, what the main concept of that presentation and what we're talking about absorbing and redirecting force is if you look at the foot mechanics of how you move. Now, this could be, it's not just straight line running, because remember, that if you look at the actual stride of what happens, whether you're going in a lateral run or a forward multi-run or coming around a bend or coming in and out of changing directions, you have all of your phases of your cycle. So you have residual phase, recovery phase, transition, ground prep, and then when the foot hits the ground. So the piston action from linear acceleration to a lot of those other motions, even on a back lateral run, a back angle lateral run, a lot of those phases are very, very similar. The main difference is going to be the ground contact phase. And linear is going to be vastly different than if you're running in a multi-directional facet. But all the other phases of the cycle is the same. So the main point of that is what happens when the foot does strike the ground. If you look at just linear sprinting, for example, but keep in mind, when you change directions, it is a linear stride out of the change of direction. So linear acceleration is not just learning in a straight line. It's every single time you change directions and run in a straight line on the first step out of that COD. So when you're looking at what happens to the foot, you have that supinate, transition, pronate, toe off. The faster you can get that to happen, the more limited your ground contact is going to be. Your rate of force development is going to go up and you're going to become faster. Not just running in a straight line, but also your ability to change directions, because the challenge is how fast is your first step out of the change direction, which completes the change direction. That's what most people fail to comprehend. They're so worried about the actual getting into the change of direction. They forget what happens when you come out of the change of direction. It's just as equally, if not more important. So the linear stride is that, but what dictates that? It's technically absorbing and redirecting force. So if you look at just the stretch shortening cycle that occurs upon ground contact, when you're looking at that ultimate supinate, transition, pronate, toe off, the gastrocnemius will control that transition. And the more highly trained that is in the facet of the absorption of force, redirecting force, the quicker this is going to happen. It's not like you can look at somebody that has long ground contact, show them, and then just say, okay, see how your ground contact's long? Let's try to limit it. That's a big misconception of speed training. Like the muscle's going to respond the way that the capability of responding to. So if the muscle has the capability of doing it, it's going to do it. If the muscle doesn't have the capability of absorbing and redirecting that force, you showing somebody is not going to automatically make that muscle stronger. That would be equivalent to walking in a weight room and saying, you bench 200 pounds. Now watch me bench 300 pounds. See the video of you benching 200, see the video of me benching 300. Oh, now you understand how to bench 300. Throw them under the bar and they bench 300. Like nobody does that. So when you're thinking of how do you get muscles stronger in a weight room? People understand micro progression and progressive overload because it's easy for them. You can count weight on a bar. You can count a weight stack. You can look at the thickness of a band resist. That's simple for them to calculate. It's the exact same thing on a field, though. What makes the gastroc strong? You're going to build the strength in the weight room, but you also have the eccentric loading capability and the dynamic eccentric loading capability, hence that progression into the overload of absorbing force. But you also have accepting body weight and redirecting force. All that stuff has a threshold that we need to maximize. And when you maximize the threshold, that is the stretch shortening cycle, the eccentric to the concentric. So as opposed to trying to just recreate the running stride or show film, which some of that stuff is important at certain appropriate times, it's simple a matter of looking at this of, well, if I'm doing the back dorsiflex series, what makes that load go up? Just like in a weight room. In a weight room, you can just count the weight. On a field, you have to look at the speed and the overload. It's more of a challenge because you can't necessarily quantify and count something, but some of this stuff in terms of the speed of the movement and how much load you put on, that's your progressive overload. So that's what I was saying is there is an art form and a necessity to get that gastroc that controls that transition threshold as high as possible on the dynamic eccentric, the accepting body weight, most importantly, the baseline plows to the advanced plows, which is that progressive into redirecting force. So people need to think about plyometrics, not of which one's better, but just like a progressive overload. You have your basic, you have your advanced. How do you transition up that chain of more force and how much force is appropriate for that individual at that time? And the other point I was making with the support system prep is we see a lot of times guarding patterns, and guarding patterns are going to happen. The frustrating part is the better the athlete, the more compensation is going to set it. That's what makes them elite. But if the compensation sets in too aggressively and for an extended length of time, the problem is that can cause a lot of joint misalignments, and that itself can cause soft tissue injuries. So what we were saying is, and we see this a lot, where you have a tightness in the hip or a tightness in the trunk or the opposite lat or something like that. And as opposed to just going to the source of this is tight, let's foam roll this. This is tight, let's stretch that. It's what we see a lot of times is if you can't absorb and redirect force, the body's got a great defense mechanism and it's going to guard out of a range you can't control. And we saw this where you have a tight misalignment in the hip, but a much more significant asymmetry or misalignment down in the joints of the toes or the forefoot, rear foot articulation or the ankle. And once we fixed the support system and increased that threshold, the hip just naturally realigned or got significantly better. So you're like, you know what? As opposed to wasting time going to the hip tightness, we just fixed the majority of that problem by making the support system more efficient and function more appropriately. Now the guarding pattern got released, and we didn't have to spend time mashing tissue on a foam roll in the hip that wasn't appropriate for that system anyway. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying that every time there's a tightness in the hip, you look at dysfunction in the foot, but that pattern pops up more than not. So the whole thing is, it popped up so much with so many levels of athletes. We were like, why wait for the neuromuscular therapist to tell us there's foot dysfunction? Everybody's got some degree of foot dysfunction, or just like some degree of, I bench X, I want to bench Y. So we stopped looking at it as dysfunction. Like, you know what, let's just strengthen it no matter what, no matter how strong and efficient that stretch shortening cycle is. I can guarantee they haven't reached their threshold yet. So we came up with that support system preparation concept for those exact reasons. And we had a lot of success with it over the years. You know, so, and you can look at that concept of anything. You have to look at these stretch reflexes. If somebody is going through a swinging motion or going through a throwing motion or any overhead motion, we consider, you know, throwing a football, throwing a softball, a cricketer, throwing a baseball, a volleyball spike, a tennis serve, an overhead swimming stroke. Those are overhead motions. And you're going to have different styles of stretch shortening cycles, whether it be on your motion that is fairly simple of elbow extension, or a diagonal pattern, or a rotation, or a press pull systematic process. there's ways to enhance the eccentric and the concentric of those types of motions as well. So we're looking at absorbing and redirecting forces. We're looking at just a threshold of eccentric strength, a threshold of dynamic eccentric load, and how that relates into that stretch shortening cycle of redirecting force. So when we started looking at the movement and the speed, the same progressive overload methods that we looked at the weight room, we just started having more success. So I was just kind of presenting those concepts and trying to give people alternative ways of thinking that's been very successful for us.
Yeah. So if your support system isn't where it needs to be, it's similar to pushing a chain. The link's going to pop out somewhere. And a lot of times you were seeing it in the hip or whatever, where the weakest link appeared to be, but it was coming from the foot.
And we've also seen that with the standards of mobility. We have a whole preparation system that we call CAMPS, CNS activation muscle joint preparation system. That's what we feel you do prior to exercise, prior to practice, prior to an event or a game or a match or whatever. We scrap the term warm up. It's an overly misused term. You don't just walk out, do random exercises to warm up. You look at the body's ability to accept and redirect force. So we looked at that same link chain. Like if you look at hip mobility that everybody wants to gain, and hip stability that everybody wants to do after you open up the mobility. Well, what makes mobility? If you're just starting to do hip circles and things like that, it's great, but sometimes people just put it in the wrong order. If you have a hip circle, you're looking at flexion, extension, horizontal abduction, horizontal adduction, internal, external rotation. If one of those processes of that hip motion is inhibited and or weak, just doing the circle itself isn't going to make that naturally start firing correctly. It's just going to have the things that are working well continue to work, and the things that are not working well continue to get ignored. And hence you might just be popping a hip circle, but it's not making you any more efficient. You just furthered the imbalance. So we even looked at, what is the order of how you prepare? Forget the warm up. If you just go through the motions, you're going to elevate tissue temperature by default, which is important. But the goal actually of what you're trying to accomplish is getting things to contract well, getting all the motions to contract well, then following that up with mobility and then stabilizing the joint. We started changing the order just based off that essential common sense. We had a lot of success with that as well.
The one thing I heard you talk about quite a bit in your NSCA presentation, which was really good, was everybody sees athletes doing movements and then they try to train the movement, but the muscle is what has to be trained. You have to develop the muscle and then the movement will come.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the movement, the needs analysis for the sport needs to be done. And there is an actual sport specificity and especially position specificity component. Number one, just the psychological effect of making people understand what we're doing and why, from the coaches to the agents to the players themselves to everybody. It's important for them to actually see the transfer. And plus you want the transfer. So that's important. But I think sometimes people get lost of what actually creates the motion. So if you want somebody to bend more or to change directions efficiently, if their foot isn't bending in inversion, for example, to the degree of how you're trying to change directions at that angle, you just running that angle isn't going to magically take those foot inverters and just get them stronger. There's ways to build that strength threshold. And this is what the great unique relationship with you and a skills coach or you and an actual sport coach is. I hear sport coaches tell me all the time, yeah, they got to be able to hit this angle. They got to throw from this angle. They got to be able to get their center mass low and this and that. And sometimes the drills they do works because there is a technique part involved in that. But if that's not working, it could just be biomechanical. Their foot or their knee or the hip doesn't bend in that angle because it's not strong enough in that range. That's our job. Our job isn't to recreate how to move as a running back. Running back coaches understand the vision and the angles and those types of scenarios that they can recreate. That's a running back's coach's job. But if I'm training a running back and he can't execute the jump cut required for that vision, and it's because of a biomechanical restriction, a running back coach isn't trained medically and biomechanically. They don't understand like what foot mechanics are involved in a jump cut. If that joint is restricted, it's restricted because of a strength issue. And trust me, a mobility restriction is usually I'm not strong in the range, the body guards out of the range. Get it contracting better in the range you want is our job, whether it's on the field, which can be trained, or in the weight room where you set the base. So I just think that's the distinct difference between what a skills coach and a performance coach needs to do. I just see too many times that if a performance coach played this sport, and especially this position, they default into trying to be a position coach too much. And sometimes I see position and sport coaches delving too much into the realm of the medical and the biomechanical science. Now, keep in mind, there's going to be an overlap. Like when my receiver coach or DB coach or my pitching coach or my hitting coach, or I've got, cricketer coaches that come in. I have a lot of sport coaches that work with me and consult with me and work out of my facility. There's going to be overlap, clearly. Like if I'm running a change direction at an angle, and that's the exact route this receiver coach is doing, or if I'm looking at this defensive position in basketball in terms of the angles it needs to be in, but it's the exact same angle that defensive basketball coach is working on, there's going to be an overlap. But their overlap is visual stimulus, verbal stimulus, and systems and feeling out the different types of vision and aspects that goes into playing that sport based off stimulus. Mine's just biomechanical. I need to understand what they need and understand, is it a technical aspect that skills coach is going to fix, or is it a biomechanical aspect that I need to fix? And here's the challenge. Sometimes it's both, and we need to work together to get it fixed and bounce the video systems back and forth. So I think that there needs to be different systems. Like I'm not going to train a defensive lineman on the intricacies of how to use your hands and the moves, but linemen need to bend. I need to take them through a pass rush track arc because that's the motion that applies to them. Now, if we're going through the arc and we go resisted, assisted, whatever we're doing on the arc, and it's a biomechanical issue, I've got plyometric drills that will raise the eccentric loading capability with the foot in an everted position, and I'll cycle it with a pass truck arc. It doesn't mean I'm trying to be a D-line coach. I just know what motion is required. Now, they take that new ability of range of motion, and when they're doing their arcs, obviously they're teaching the actual hand motions and the pass rush moves that's incorporated with different styles of arcs at different angles. That's the difference between me and a position coach. So I just think that even the value of people that played high-level sports, I'm not saying they can't be strength coaches. I have a lot of people that work for me and have worked for me that have played very high-level professional sports. But once they cross that line, they better be trained medically and biomechanically to be able to specialize this. Now, the great thing is they have a huge advantage over somebody like me that never played professional sports because they understand better than anybody the psychology and the mentality and putting a certain twist on things in addition to the biomechanics. But they can't just transfer over because they understand the motions. They better be able to understand the joint restrictions. So the biggest value, if you have somebody that played at a high level, but has the motivation and the mindset to learn the sports science, you're going to have a phenomenal practitioner. And that's one thing that I definitely encourage is they have an advantage, but they can't just default into what they know. Then all they are is a glorified position coach that kind of yells and screams in the weight room. You know what I'm saying? They need to be able to have that balance.
The one thing I thought I had stumbled upon, and I was having a hard time getting guys to corroborate it, and in that NSCA video, I think you hit on it and maybe gave credence to what I was thinking. But in that box squat, I watched a lot of your guys on tape, and they really keep them hips up. They really keep them hips high. They don't roll back. That seems to carry over better to the field for jumping and sprinting. Am I seeing that right, or am I missing something?
I have different versions of box squats that I do for different reasons at different times. I will do a high box squat, which, yes, you're right. High box squat is more specific to your motion on a field because if you're coming out of an acceleration stride, your foot attacks the ground, you're not in a deep position. So if we're going to do a conjugate phase and we're in our peak portion of a 3-week microcycle on a conjugate, we will lighten the load down to 50, 55, 60%, put a ton of variable load chains and bands on there, track bar velocity, look at force plate data, and go high box so we can significantly increase that bar velocity. But keep in mind, just because that's more specific doesn't make it better. I'm never going to get there and get efficiency at that level if I did not preclude that with deep parallel box squats on the same speed squat interval. The great thing to me is I look at a lot of the research that came out of Brian Mann, that just came out of University of Miami. I think he was at Missouri before that, and talk about the concepts of strength, speed, and speed, strength, and bar velocities and the progressions. We look at that like it's gold. I mean, that's a progressive way of thinking. And the research is so mapping towards the application with his data that, yes, sometimes we will do those deep squats and sometimes we'll do the high box squats. Now, the other thing you mentioned in terms of the rollback, I see what a lot of powerlifters do when you sit on the box. Your shins are perpendicular to the ground, kind of have that rollback, and then your hamstrings are driving you off the box. You have to be an extremely experienced squatter to be able to stabilize the trunk and spine as you're sitting back and kind of unloading the legs in that position. And while I can't speak on the efficiency of how that relates to something like powerlifting, because I'm not a powerlifter, I'm not a powerlifting coach, even though I went through those cycles before. I just think that the danger significantly outweighs the benefit with an athlete, even though I look at and I understand biomechanically what that's going to do to the posterior chain. So we'd rather just do a simpler box squat where you're sitting back, your shins are definitely not perpendicular to the ground. And when you hit the box, you are pausing. I do want that style of unloading the eccentric, the warp build concentric power. But we are not at any point in time sitting back. We are maintaining that squat position and just holding at various levels. And if we want to wreck the posterior chain on something else, we will just do all of our supplemental exercises after the fact. So that's not saying there's anything negative against people that do that. I've just seen a lot of people at many levels that have gotten injured doing that. I did try it for one off season earlier in my career. Nobody did get hurt, thank God, when I was doing it. But some of the stories that I've heard, and people have even done where they've sat back, slightly lifted the feet and came up. I've seen a lot of very high level people that I respect that have told me, because I actually went through an off season when I was doing that with my NFL athletes and everything. They're like, Pete, just be careful. You kind of got lucky. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, you know what, they're right. I was kind of playing with fire with this one a little bit, so it's just not worth it. Now, can a lot of powerlifters that their whole life is squatting do that, or Olympic weightlifters? Probably. But that's their entire job, is squatting. We squat to have transfers in different facets of movement. They're not like running and changing directions. They can focus a lot more on the intricacies of squatting. And plus, they don't have to worry about, well, let's just go into a maintenance phase because we're going to get wrecked for the next 5 months playing the season. Like, their season is their meets, and that's kind of the thing. So I just think that no matter how efficient you are at teaching the form on that, I think that it's a little bit dangerous, and you're going to get the same concentric power and dynamic eccentric load benefit by not sitting back and rocking back on the box. But yes, you are right. I do multiple levels. And it's not that one is better than the other. You need them both. Just one is more specific.
Well, I know this is your busiest time of year, Coach, and in an effort to get you out of the office and get you back home, I'll start wrapping this thing up. But
I'll be at the office all night. Don't worry about me, man. I'm at the office behind me, and I'll probably sleep here tonight, so it's all good.
I heard you talk about, and I think this is amazing, but you take your slow eccentrics and then you eventually get into very, very fast eccentrics where you're almost free falling to the box, catching yourself with a hard catch right above the box, setting down and coming up.
That is hands down, without a doubt, one of the most effective things that we do. If you want the transfer, you master that, but you've got to progress into it. The X1X tempo on a dynamically loaded squat, and I'm talking about heavy dynamic variable loading. I mean, a lot of chains, a lot of bands, and measure bar velocity and get force plate data immediately. We go into some of those days with an unknown number of sets. The key to us is the number of sets is going to be based off the potentiation effect that, thank God, we can quantify through force plate data. But before we can get there, you got to measure bar velocity and stay true to what your assignment is and what your focus is. Is it on the strength speed or is it on the speed strength concept? But yeah, when you look at the potentiation effect, if this is done right and you get that conjugate phase, you get to that peak, you're starting to hit those X1Xs, it's like clockwork. The potentiation will go through the roof right when you start to master that concept. And I'm telling you, when you start hitting that and the force plate data is not only peaking, but it becomes symmetrical, within 7 to 10 days, you will peak your splits within speed. And I've seen it every single time. That exact map, that exact plan. That's the research we're putting out right now, which is, I think, groundbreaking with Nova. And we've been playing around with this with research sites for a couple of years. It is mapping to that effect. I want that to be the blueprint for the transfer. That's the underlying aspect of everybody in sports performance. When and how, and most importantly, how do you quantify the transfer from weight room strength to the field? That is it. At least that's the trends we see. Now, keep in mind, we are only doing this in a research capacity with high-level professional athletes. But we do see the same trends with youth athletes. We just have not necessarily put it into a research study.
In that seminar, and then right there, you talked about using 50% bar weight. Will you ever drop down to 30% bar weight for the explosive side of the strength curve and then stack chains and bands on that, or do you stay right there at the 50?
I mean, I would say probably, because when you look at some of the really strong guys that I got, linemen, 50% is an arbitrary number. We're not maxing these guys out. We're not even really doing a lot of double leg, heavy loaded on the max effort day anyway, to even be able to quantify what 50% is. If I had to guess, they might be down in 40, 30%. Who really cares? I mean, a lot of the times when I'm hitting the conjugate phase and it's with an athlete on the opposing day of the max effort, I'm going single leg anyway. I'm going loaded Bulgarian squat. If it's double leg, I am driving insane levels of hip bridges, or a lot of people call it supine hip thrust, whatever the terminology is. I rarely do like heavy loaded squat one day and speed squat the other day. So a lot of times I'm just kind of guessing on what the load is. So probably it dips down to 30, 40%. I just say 50% on average, up to 60, because that's probably where it is. Unless I got a really strong lineman that if I push the limits, yeah, he might be a 500-600 pound squatter that we don't know, because we don't do 500-600 pound max effort style squats. And if we're doing that bar tracking at 195, 200, 225 pounds, that might be below 50%. But the way I look at it is, who really cares? I mean, the main thing is the bar velocity and the force plate data in that phase anyway. So I think we think a lot less about what true percentage of a random arbitrary guess of a 1RM squat is, and more to the point of what that velocity and force plate data says. Now, 50% is a really good number to start. So if you're training a team and you do have some of that data and you need to control a large number of athletes, at least you have a gauge, hey, 50, 55, 60%. You know, but we do this with everything. I mean, we have one of those elite fitness leg presses, you know, one of the unilateral ones where you can separate the plates, and it's gigantic. So you can get guys that are 7 feet versus 5 feet, and you can band the hell out of this thing. You can measure the velocity of the sled itself. We do our dynamic phases on that, for Christ's sake. And again, we're estimating around 50%. Now, it might be a little bit easier on that front because we will heavy load leg press a lot of these guys, but the same concept holds true. Just gauge it and measure and track the potentiation. I think that's the key when you hit those dynamic phases. And if you do that and you quantify and track that data, it will transfer. I mean, based on what we see anyway.
In that same seminar, you also talked about loaded and unloaded plyos. When you added loaded plyos in with chains and bands, that way the chains can unload, what differences did you really see?
Are you talking on the weight room or on the field?
Well, you were talking about plyos, so I guess it would probably be more on the field. And you were talking about holding chains, that way they can unload and then jump into the chains.
But there's different facets to the plyometrics. We will build the base of a lot of vertical plyometrics in the weight room. I mean, especially now that we can track force plate data. And you can load it or unload it. So like a loaded would be like a Vertimax, and unloaded would be like a band assistant with the triphasic arms. But we do the same thing out on the field. Like if you look at an acceleration bound, for example, and that's the mecca of all horizontal plyometrics with the piston action anyway, you can do them with more of a load because you have so many devices now that allow for that, whether it be the Extra Genie trainer, the Raptor. I mean, even that overspeed pulley machine that we get off of everythingtrackandfield.com. I mean, you go backwards, you're in a constant semi-heavy loaded pulley resistant. That is a load that's going to force more lean and better foot mechanics, but it's still a load. On the contrast, when you start doing assisted overspeed acceleration bounds, look what you're doing. That's still not necessarily unloading, you're loading, because when you drive somebody that fast and that leg starts to dangle in residual phase, the stretch shortening cycle that you get on the hip flexor is loaded. And if you can power through that and get the knee up into the opposing side on that alternate acceleration bound, that to me is a load. That's the progression. Now, how do you get there? You got to build the base with vertical plows, and we'll do them unloaded on a field, like depth jumps and different types of depth tuck jumps, and leading into it by the rhythm depth jumps or the jumps itself. But you got to also build the foundation with whether it can be like an overspeed resistance. Like if you're doing a Vertimax, that thing's pulling you into the ground, and your just ability to land and redirect is there. Now, what you might be talking about is a lot of times we will get somebody up on a box or a bench or a variable height thing. And because we have those racks, we can grab bands and attach to the rack. So when you're falling into your depth drop or depth jump, it is driving you into the ground, kind of like the Vertimax does, just with a lot more force. And you can land and then redirect force there. That's how we build the foundation. So we get to those quick depth jumps on the field, and the ultimate goal is to get to the bounding. Now, piston action will be horizontal bounding. The cycle leg action will be absolute speed bounding, but or really the moving claw sequence. But the great thing is you can add the resisted or assisted forces very easily, even in groups, because of all the devices that's now available to us. I'm not sure if that even answered your question. I kind of got on a tangent there. Was that what you're referring to?
Yes, it was a great tangent, and you did come around and you kind of answered the question I had set up, so I really appreciate that. But in that same one, and you were building on it in that answer, was the depth jump is the bridge between vertical plyometrics and horizontal plyometrics.
Well, I always say this, when people are looking at plyometrics, and I've spoken this many times, it's a significant part of my speed certification. If you want to get the ultimate effect of a horizontal plyometric, the most specific form of a plyometric that's going to transfer, it's assisted overspeed sprinting. Now, there's danger in that. So how do you progress there? Purely from a plyometric standpoint. The way I look at it, if you are effectively hitting a couple of sessions of moving claw sequence at the advanced level, like straight leg bound moving claw, you are ready for overspeed. Well, how do you know if you're ready for moving claw? If you've effectively hit a couple of sessions of acceleration bounding, you're ready for moving claw. Well, how do you know if you're ready for acceleration bounding? If you've effectively hit a few sessions of depth jumping. There is a progressive level of that 4-cycle system. Now, keep in mind that's in addition to, is your posterior chain strong and symmetrical, which we can track and quantify. Does the support system even have the ability to absorb and redirect force? But that's going to be built alongside that plyometric progression. But most importantly is your trunk and spine symmetricals. So you have got to make sure that your isometrics with spinal lateral flexion and spinal rotation are equivalent right versus left to withstand the leg whipping force of what that puts on the lumbar spine. If you can do that, then yes, you're ready for overspeed. But from a purely plyometric standpoint, you got to go up that progressive level. That's where I think the depth jump fits in. Is this the baseline of how you get into the piston alternate acceleration bound that moves you up that chain?
I know this how crazy this time of year must be for you and the stress level you got getting everybody ready for Indianapolis, so that you would take some time, stop what you're doing, come on the podcast. It means the world to me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's all good. I mean, this is what I do. I mean, it's not just NFL draft prep. I mean, that's the one thing that we talk about now, but I mean, we still have Major League Baseball guys here, minor league baseball guys here, pro soccer is hitting its peak. All of our NFL vets are back in their realignment general preparatory phase. Youth is exploding. We had a whole cricket academy that we just were working with about an hour ago. So, but education's my thing. I mean, I'm a professor at Nova. I'm on their advisory board. We do a lot of conjunctive research. And that's why I started Bommarito University, because I want to spread the wealth to the industry that's been so good to me. So I'm always happy to come on and do these things. Doesn't matter what time of year it is. This is my passion. So I'm glad to do it.
Well, you've been leading the pack for years, and I anticipate that will be the case for many more. So thank you very much, Coach.
All right, no problem.